The nation of Japan embarked on a radical transformation of its political and cultural life beginning in the year 1868. For centuries, Japan had been ruled by an emperor who was revered as a divine figure and a son of the sun god. His rule was absolute. But in the 17th century, powerful generals known as shoguns had asserted their power over the nation and were the de facto rulers. Japan's emperors remained even upon the arrival of the shogun, but the emperors became more of ceremonial figures exercising little true power and influence over the nation. After 300 years of shogun rule, however, the military generals increasingly struggled to garner national and international respect. Many Japanese expressed increased alarm regarding the influence of foreigners on the nation, and a series of particularly weak shoguns made the system seem old and tired. The removal of the shoguns and the reassertion of imperial rule in 1868 marked an important watershed in Japanese history and Japan's entry into the modern world. It was a young and dynamic emperor who effected the change. Emperor Meiji established the Meiji Restoration to place Japan back on a path that respected the power and influence of the emperor. The new emperor, however, would be different from his predecessors. His close alliance and familiarity with Westerners meant that Japan would be departing from its isolationist and traditionalist past during the Shogun period and enter a new era of modernization. It is hard to overstate the transformation that the Emperor Meiji brought to Japan. Under his rule, Western styles and customs became popular and not shunned. Japan was industrialized and became the premier military power in the Eastern Hemisphere. The emperor's popular wife, Haruko, signaled the changes her husband brought to Japan by herself wearing Western styles and appearing much more modern than her predecessors. Western dress, food, music, and literature became widely popular in Japan for the first time after the Meiji Restoration. Universal public education was adopted that was modeled on Western, particularly American, systems of education. Even women were expected to be educated, and large sections of Japanese women learned to read for the first time. The Meiji Restoration also had immense implications for the Japanese economy as well. Tea processing, silk production, textiles, and shipbuilding all became industrialized and produced on a much larger scale than before. Expanded trade with the West meant more exports, greater profits, expanded industries, new technologies, and a higher standard of living than ever before for the people of Japan. Japan also began to extract more natural resources from its territory. Japanese coal production increased from 1/2 million tons in 1875 to 21 million tons in 1913, providing an abundant source of energy and an expanded export. Even though Japan produced limited amounts of iron ore, a nascent steel industry was formed that forged the materials for modern cities and a modern military. A modern Japanese navy commenced construction at the same time as the Meiji Restoration that would become the pride and obsession of Japanese leaders in the decades to come. The Kotetsu was Japan's first ironclad warship, launched in 1865, the first ship of what would become in the early 20th century one of the largest navies in the world. Japanese steel was employed to lay down a rail system that connected Japanese cities in a new manner and led to a new sense of national unity and connection. Japan built its first railroad in 1872, and by World War I, the nation had 7,000 miles of railroad track. The modern society that Japan was constructing was on full display when Tokyo hosted the 1907 Industrial Exhibition. Visitors were amazed that an Asian nation had progressed so far so quickly into the modern world. Tokyo became the center of much more of this new life. Although an ancient capital for the emperors, the shoguns had ruled from Kyoto. Emperor Meiji restored imperial rule to Tokyo, a name that means Eastern capital. Steel buildings became larger and architecture more modern as the new city grew to unprecedented heights. Certainly by the 1920s, Westerners became enamored with Tokyo's nightlife and its sophistication on the Asian continent. Other cities as well grew during Emperor Meiji's reign, including Kyoto, Yokohama, Kanagawa, and the important military and port city of Hiroshima. The world first witnessed the newfound military power of Japan during the First Sino-Japanese War in 1894 to 1895. Whereas China had always been viewed as the premier power center in the Far East, the war showed that Japan had now usurped that role. The war was essentially fought over control of the Korean peninsula. The Japanese army and military enjoyed weeks of uninterrupted successes against the Chinese and proved their early ability at tactics and strategy. Modern ironclad Japanese battleships shelled the inferior and poorly commanded Chinese fleet and swiftly took control of the bays and straits surrounding the Korean peninsula. Japanese subjugation of Chinese forces and brutal beheading of POWs also showed the darker side of Japanese militarism that would become more prevalent in conflicts to come. After feeling the success of supplanting their traditional Chinese rivals, the Japanese militarists turned their attention to their other large neighbor in the North Pacific. In the history of warfare, no Asiatic power had ever defeated a European, including Russian, power. Asian nations were viewed as inferior to European states, and no new result was anticipated when Japan went to war against Russia in 1904. Even more than its first war with China, Japan's war against Russia in the Russo-Japanese War made it completely clear that Japan would be a 20th century power to contend with. Sensing the weakness and decline of Tsarist Russia and eager to exercise influence in the North Pacific in an increased manner, Imperial Japan provoked the war with Russia by means of a sneak attack against a Russian naval installation at Port Arthur. On February 8, 1904, Japanese destroyers covertly snuck into Port Arthur and attacked the moored Russian Pacific Fleet. The Russian fleet was taken by surprise. The Japanese inflicted 150 casualties on the Russians and damaged 7 ships. The Japanese lost 90 men and suffered only minor damage. Japanese planners had hoped for even more significant results, but the sneak attack at Port Arthur confirmed in the minds of Japanese strategists the value of disabling a would-be enemy's fleet even before the prospective combatant had declared war. The surprise attack at Port Arthur was effective enough to inspire the Japanese to use the strategy again 37 years later. Japanese land forces also engaged Russian troops in Manchuria at the Battle of Mukden. Mukden was quite possibly the largest land battle in world history to that point and inflicted a stunning number of casualties on both sides. The Japanese drove the Russians from the field and seized portions of Manchuria. After experiencing the embarrassment of Port Arthur and additional defeat at Mukden, Russian High Command decided to reroute its Baltic fleet to the Pacific to turn the tide of the war against the Japanese. Russia's Pacific Fleet had been disabled or holed up at Port Arthur, leaving the Japanese Navy free range in the Pacific. By sending its Baltic Fleet to the Pacific, the Russians would be able to supplement their presence in the Pacific Ocean. The Russian Baltic Fleet embarked on an extensive and exhausting journey all the way from northern Europe to the other side of the world. Some ships traveled through the Mediterranean Sea and the Suez Canal, and others made the even more arduous journey around the whole of Africa and then through the Indian Ocean. Regardless of the route, the Russian fleet was exhausted and ill-prepared to face the awaiting fresh Japanese fleet. The two navies clashed at the Battle of Tsushima in the Korean Straits just off the Korean Peninsula. The Battle of Tsushima was one of the first battles fought in history between steel battleships on both sides. The Japanese fleet scored a great success in the battle by managing to pull off the tricky and rare naval maneuver called crossing the T. By cutting across the oncoming Russian fleet, the Japanese fleet was able to fire full broadsides against the Russians, while the Russians could only fire the guns at their bows. The battle was humiliating for Russia, which lost all of its battleships and most of its cruisers and destroyers. The Russians lost a staggering 4,380 killed and 5,917 captured, including 2 admirals, with a further 1,862 captured. The Japanese lost 3 torpedo boats, with only 117 men killed and 500 wounded. Russia's massive defeats at Port Arthur, Mukden, and especially Tsushima prompted it to be open to peace talks with the Japanese. It was the United States President Theodore Roosevelt who intervened and offered to host the talks. The naval yard at Portsmouth, New Hampshire was chosen for the 2 sides to meet. Russia was facing approaching revolution at home, and Japan's economy had been severely strained by the war. Both sides wanted to see a conclusion to the war. The treaty, therefore, effected an immediate ceasefire. Korea was granted to Japan, soon to become its colony. Remaining Russian forces evacuated Manchuria. Port Arthur was returned as a possession of China. The South Manchurian Railroad and mines were granted to Japan. Sakhalin Island was given to Japan. Russia was not forced to pay any reparations. President Theodore Roosevelt would receive the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts towards bringing the 2 sides together for peace. Probably the most notable consequence of the Russo-Japanese War was that for the first time in world history, an Asiatic power had defeated a Western power. Confidence, even overconfidence, was one of the most significant prizes Japan took from its war with Russia. The Western world took note of Japan's victory and became increasingly alarmed regarding the growing power of the Japanese military. Particularly in the United States, many began to speak of the Yellow Peril, the danger of a resurgent Japan and the possible threat that Japanese residing in the United States may pose for national security. The American author G.G. Rupert raised these concerns in his publication, The Yellow Peril. Although many Japanese had migrated to the west coast of the United States in the 19th century, they were increasingly viewed with suspicion, particularly as the Imperial Japanese government continued to demonstrate aggression and militarism in the Far East. As an indicator of the deteriorating relationship between West Coast residents and Japanese residents was the 1907 Gentlemen's Agreement. Motivated by the fear of Japanese expansion and infiltration, President Theodore Roosevelt formed an agreement with the Japanese government in hopes of reducing the tensions. The Japanese government promised not to send additional Japanese as immigrants to the United States, and the American government promised not to impose additional restrictions on current Japanese-American residents. The 1907 Gentlemen's Agreement was one of the earliest indicators that the historically good relationship between the United States and Japan was beginning to become suspicious and contentious. By 1912, when Emperor Meiji died, it is difficult to overstate the tremendous changes that he had effected for Japan by the time of his death. The Japan at the time of his ascension and the Japan at the time of his death were 2 completely different places. The Japan at the time of his death was modernized, industrialized, westernized, and rapidly emerging as a significant military and world power. Emperor Meiji was succeeded by his son, who became Emperor Taisho. Emperor Taisho was not the strong and visionary leader that his father was, which opened a power vacuum in Japan, providing an opportunity for powerful forces to step into. Significant changes for Japan commenced during the Taisho period that would have significant implications for our 20th century Japan. Universal male suffrage was introduced in 1925, widespread voting led to the creation of political parties, and very quickly party allegiances created a very partisan society and political system. Rivalries hardened, and even violence was employed to advance the fortunes of a party. Later, harsh penalties were imposed for political dissidents. The new emperor was a very sickly man, which prompted the shift in political party from the old oligarchic group of elder statesmen, or genro, to the imperial diet of Japan and the democratic parties. Thus, the era is considered the time of the liberal movement known as Taisho democracy in Japan. It is usually distinguished from the preceding chaotic Meiji period and the following militaristic-driven first part of the Showa period. Japan participated in World War I from 1914 to 1918 in an alliance with the Allied powers and played an important role in securing the sea lanes in the West Pacific and Indian Ocean against the Imperial German Navy. Politically, the Japanese Empire seized the opportunity to expand its influence over China and gain recognition as a great power. Britain, France, and the United States were desperate for allies during the First World War, and thus they were willing to overlook Japan's growing expansionism if Japan was willing to assist the Allies in the war effort in the Pacific. The aversion to another world war and a growing concern about the expanding size of the Japanese Navy were two significant motivators for the convening of the Washington Naval Conference in 1921 and 1922. The Washington Naval Conference was a large disarmament conference that sought to reduce the size of the world's biggest navies, setting the naval tonnage ratios for Britain, the United States, and Japan. The ratio for naval tonnage for Britain and the United States was set at 5 and 5, but the ratio for Japan was set at 3. Japan, of course, felt embittered by the slight and subsequently withdrew entirely from the agreement, enabling them to launch a massive naval construction program outside of the protocols of the conference. Ratios for aircraft carriers were also discussed at the conference as the signatories began to realize the strategic and tactical significance of the new flat tops. Once Japan withdrew from the treaty, Japan embarked on a large-scale carrier construction program that would put Japan at number 1 for numbers of carriers by the beginning of World War II. Emperor Taisho contracted cerebral meningitis and possibly lead poisoning as a child and died of pneumonia on December 25, 1926. Japan would embark on a new course again during the reign of Emperor Hirohito. Hirohito did not suffer from the limitations of his father, but he did not have the control over the nation that his grandfather enjoyed. Hirohito was born in 1922 and enjoyed all the privileges afforded to a royal heir of the Japanese throne. Hirohito served in the Japanese Army and Navy, including during World War I. He was well educated and traveled extensively to a multitude of nations. Prince Hirohito married his distant cousin, Princess Nagako Kuni, on January 26, 1924. They would have 2 sons and 5 daughters together. Hirohito's father died on December 25, 1926, and Hirohito inherited the throne and was thereafter not referred to by his name, but rather as the Emperor, or His Majesty. Amidst all the significant changes and events that would consume Japan during Hirohito's reign, the man himself remains a controversial figure. Some historians point the finger to him as a significant figure in the Japanese state who could have acted to block the emergence of militarism in Japan. Others believe Hirohito was increasingly marginalized in the government and was more of a figurehead who was carried along by events rather than influencing them. What is clear is that during Hirohito's reign, a growing party of militarists increasingly gained control of the Japanese government and influenced the direction of the country. The militarists in the parliament, cabinet, and premiership set Japan on a course for territorial expansion and military engagement. In 1873, universal military conscription was introduced. In 1878, the Army and Navy earned their independence from civilian control and only needed to report to the emperor. In 1882, an important publication, the Imperial Rescript to Soldiers and Sailors, became a publication promoting military indoctrination for Japan's soldiers and sailors. German generals traveled to Japan to act as advisors. Secret patriotic and paramilitary societies were formed and grew in popularity in Japan. There was increased popular discussion regarding Japan's desire for international respect to be achieved through expansionism and imperialism. During these years, Japan also became more aware of the nation's need for coal, iron ore, and oil resources. In addition, a growing anti-foreigner sentiment swelled in Japan and a series of failed coups revealed the instability of the government and the greater risk towards totalitarian leanings. Japanese soldiers and sailors became the most esteemed members of society, and universal service meant a larger and larger section of the Japanese population was being indoctrinated by militarism. The militaristic faction in the government and services was looking for a pretext to demonstrate their prowess and even provoke a war with China once again. A particularly aggressive army garrison decided to provoke such an incident in 1931. On September 18, 1931, a right-wing army garrison detonated a small amount of dynamite on Japan's South Manchurian Railroad. Immediately, the Japanese government claimed the Chinese militants had perpetrated an attack on a Japanese railway. Government inspectors called the attack railway sabotage. However, as can be seen from this photograph, the track was not even damaged by the dynamite the Japanese placed on their own tracks. Nevertheless, Japan now had the pretext they wanted to go to war with China, and consequently proceeded to invade Manchuria. Japan invaded Manchuria and claimed the region of China as its own possession. Japan quickly subdued the region after defeating troops of the Chinese National Army. Japan's industrialization and militarization ensured their growing dependence on oil and metal imports from the United States. The United States sanctions, which prevented trade with the United States, resulted in Japan furthering their expansion in the territory of China and Southeast Asia, looking for natural resources. 6 months later, after the invasion of Manchuria, Japan established a puppet state in the region called Manchukuo. Manchukuo was added to Japanese dominions in the rapidly expanding Japanese Empire. To establish a sense of legitimacy, the Japanese installed the last emperor of China, Puyi, as the puppet emperor of Manchukuo. Puyi held next to no power or real influence in Manchukuo, but he was conveniently used by the Japanese to establish continuity in the region. Recognizing their common interests and similar agendas for their respective continents, Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany contracted a treaty of alliance in 1936. The military, or supposed defensive alliance, was particularly directed against the Soviet Union, which lay between their two nations. The Anti-Comintern Pact was directed against communist infiltration within their nations, but signaled to much of the world that several nations were forming alliances and creating rivalries that had the potential to doom the hope for peace. The Second Sino-Japanese War, that is, war between China and Japan, commenced in 1937 and would last until the conclusion of the Second World War. Japan was looking for a reason to expand its holdings in China beyond Manchuria and to provoke a war to do so. They found their reason in the so-called Marco Polo Bridge incident. A Japanese soldier wandered away from his company, presumably into a local Chinese town. The Japanese commander asked the local Chinese magistrate to search the town, but was denied. Tensions escalated until Chinese nationalist troops fired on a Japanese unit. The government of Japan claimed the incident was an attack by Chinese forces and launched a full-scale invasion of China. Japanese forces landed at Shanghai and immediately began operations to take the city. Thousands of civilians were caught up in the street fighting that ensued and perished. This iconic photograph of a seated baby crying amidst the ruins of a Shanghai train station was an earlier indicator of how the destruction of the Second World War would often fall on a nation's most vulnerable populations. After gaining control of Shanghai, Japanese forces proceeded to the Chinese city of Nanking. It was at Nanking that some of the greatest atrocities of the Second World War occurred. On December 13th, the Japanese army entered the Republic of China's capital city. Although many residents had evacuated Nanking, tens of thousands of civilians were deliberately slaughtered by the Japanese troops. Japanese officers personally beheaded local Chinese residents. Troops bayoneted and impaled men, women, and children. Some residents of Nanking were tortured, before they were finally murdered. This is a picture of a Japanese soldier beheading a Chinese man in the center of a village square. This article, published in Tokyo, carried the headline of "Contest to Kill 100 People Using a Sword." These two Japanese soldiers were featured, who had killed 106 and 105 victims by beheading. Smugly, the article writes, both second lieutenants go into extra innings, exceeding the 100 beheadings. Upwards of 20,000 of Nanking women were raped by Japanese soldiers before they too were murdered. Many of the victims' bodies were tossed along the riverbank near Nanking. It is impossible to know how many Chinese victims there were due to the rape of Nanking, but historians estimate the numbers could be as high as 200 to 300,000 murders. The rape of Nanking, or the Nanking Massacre, remains one of the largest episodes of mass murder during the entire Second World War. Japanese forces continued their takeover of major Chinese cities and also moved inland along major rivers, effectively gaining control of China for the duration of World War II. Marching south, the Japanese Imperial Army advanced and occupied Indochina, that is, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand in 1940 and 1941. By 1941, Japan's vision of a Greater East co-prosperity sphere had largely been realized. Besides islands to its north, Japan had also gained control of the Korean Peninsula, Taiwan, Manchuria, much of eastern China, Indochina, Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand. Japanese propaganda advertised its empire as a diversity of Asian peoples living in harmony and prosperity. The reality for subjugated peoples, of course, was far different. Japan next set its sights on Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, and additional Pacific island groups. The dilemma Japan faced, however, was the growing opposition expressed by the United States to its militaristic imperialism. Japan relied on key exports from the United States such as scrap iron, airplane parts, steel, coal, and oil, which fueled its war machine. President Roosevelt demanded Japan withdraw from China in order for these American exports to continue. Otherwise, Japan would not have the aviation and naval fuel it would need to keep its military properly supplied. When the Japanese government refused U.S. demands to refrain from further expansionism, the Congress of the United States passed and President Franklin Roosevelt signed the Export Control Act of 1940. The Export Control Act of 1940 is sometimes called a moral embargo, as it was designed to punish and curtail Japan's ability to make war against its neighbors. It increasingly prohibited the vital materials the Japanese Army and Navy needed to make war, including aircraft parts, scrap iron, steel, coal, and oil. It also blocked Japan from using the Panama Canal to ship natural resources from other countries. At this critical inflection point for the Japanese military, a new, even more militaristic premier became Premier of Japan. Hideki Tojo was a career Japanese soldier who consistently supported and perpetrated massacres against civilians. He saw no other future for Japan than additional bold strikes to hold and expand its current empire. With diminishing supplies, particularly of oil from the United States, Japan faced the choice of either conceding to U.S. demands and withdrawing from occupied territories, or launching a preemptive strike against the United States, which would enable Japan to exercise free will in the Pacific. Presumably, if the U.S. Navy was not a force to be reckoned with in the Pacific, Japan would be able to move against the Philippines, Hong Kong, Singapore, and most importantly, the Dutch East Indies, which were rich with oil. In 1941, when he became Prime Minister of Japan, Tojo advocated for a preemptive strike against U.S. naval forces to prevent any further obstructions to the Japanese war effort. Thus, in early 1941, Japanese war planners aggressively started planning a surprise attack against the United States. That attack, strangely reminiscent of the attack on Port Arthur many years earlier, would of course occur at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii on December 7, 1941.